Welcome back, everyone. This is the Pop Culture Association Vampire Studies Area virtual conference experience. We have another great installment for y'all, and I'm so excited to talk with our guest tonight. But first, let me introduce you to Area Co-Chair Melissa Anwio, who's going to introduce our author for tonight. Melissa, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Amanda. So today I'm so happy to announce that we will be talking to Rebecca Lynn Paynich, one of my dearest friends, who also works with me at Curry College, and she's writing her very first novel. So today what we're looking at is the ways in which the vampire inspires us, and of course, how on earth you start writing your first novel. So we're going to run down some questions with Becky. Becky, would you prefer Becky or Rebecca?
Becky's fine.
So we'll be running down some questions with Becky. So Becky, if you'd just like to start, so would you tell us a tiny little bit about your background as a way of an introduction?
Okay, so I am one of 5 kids. My dad was Air Force, so we moved around a lot. And they're Mormons, devout Mormons, so they're very, very conservative and religious, still are. And love them dearly, but I'm on a different path, and that's about that. I mean, I went to school, I got a PhD in political science with a emphasis on criminal justice organizations, and so that's where I do most of my teaching and my research. My PhD was from Washington State University, Wazoo. I was there at the time. My first tenure track teaching position was in Minot State University in North Dakota, and I had actually spent 8 years as a child in Minot. And so I went there, met my now Jason. Melissa will giggle about that. She knows I've had a few lovely Jasons in my life. We got married and we moved out here and have been here ever since. Loving it. We're actually going back west again for the summer tomorrow. We leave tomorrow.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So this session that we're doing is Bram Stoker's Legacies. So we're looking at the ways in which many of us were inspired by particularly Stoker's Dracula, whether it's our scholarship, whether it's our fiction. So did he have any influence on your work? Did you read Dracula? Had you even heard of it?
Yes. Actually, I wouldn't say that it was largely influential. I did read it in high school. I was very interested in the paranormal ever since I was a young child. Loved the ideas of vampires, I'm from the 80s, so, you got The Lost Boys, you got all these great, vampire movies, which is is it the one with Keanu Reeves in 2003, 4-ish, I think? Is that about right, give or take? I think that's the one I remember most, no?
Say it again?
I think that
was it earlier?
90s?
God, I'm getting
it was like 94, 95. Wow, we're old.
Yeah, with Winona Ryder, right? And Keanu Reeves. Okay, so that was one where I think I first connected more with the story, the love story, there's a couple love stories going on in that. And so, yeah, definitely that he that was one of the first probably books and movies that I had, paid attention to relative to the vampire. I didn't spend my life studying them like you have, but definitely that was a piece on that long train towards where I'm at now. We'll talk in a minute, but Buffy was a big one for me, so there were some others, but definitely I'm very familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I would say it definitely did, does play into and did impact me.
Thank you. So thoughting on that a little, I think of you as actually the most romantic person I know.
Aww.
However you define romance. So what inspired you to write your first novel, and why did you go down the romance route? Or do you even think your novel is a romance novel? Because we have neighbors that might not apply.
I think there's definitely a love story there, definitely. And you and I have had conversations about, is this more urban fantasy? Is this more, a romance? Is this, what is this? And I'm not still yet entirely sure what, it will be. The love story is front and center between Angus, who is the vampire, and Mara, who is the reincarnated witch. Those are the two main characters. I forgot to mention Dark Shadows. My mom loved soap operas. So Dark Shadows was definitely in that long train of vampires. So I think a couple of things came together for me in terms of why I got to the point where I thought, oh, maybe I'll write a novel. So one happens to be probably the first piece would be my pregnancy with Jack. Jack, I found out he had spina bifida. I wasn't even halfway through the pregnancy. So I started a journey that still continues today, looking at the mind-body connection, which, started off with books. Brain Wars was one of the first books I read on mind-body connection. And it kind of took me in a couple of different directions, but a lot of it went towards metaphysics and quantum physics. It also took me into a many years journey. I mean, he's going on 10 now, of healing work. So I have spent a lot of time studying different kinds of Reiki, different kinds of energy work, things that, I use on myself and my family and my friends. It's not something that I ever thought that I would use in any other way. So the second piece, I guess, would have to be, because I'm fortunate in terms of my education, and I have a decent brain. That's an important thing to be grateful for. I could read fast, and so I read a ton of books, and I started to see all these crazy connections between things, right? So the second piece of that is I was doing some work in, I think it was early 2015 in Honduras. I was there doing like my real job. I was teaching their national task force some crime mapping and analysis skills to help them in some of their efforts against extortion by the MS-13 gang down there. So when I came back, I wasn't feeling very well for a while. I must have picked up a bug. I was sick for a while. A mutual colleague of ours, a literature professor, had been bugging me for years to read these books, Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. At that point, it'd probably been close to 20 years since I had read a fiction book. I mean, Bram Stoker's Dracula might have been one of the last books that I read prior to this journey. I mean, I read some fun books, but fun books for me were like The Signal and the Noise, right? With the mathematics and the, Malcolm Gladwell's books. They were like brain candy, thinking ideas books. So anyways, at that point in time, Outlander was now a TV show. So I binge watched it. At that point, it had been about halfway through season 1. I called her up and I said, "Are you kidding me? You got to tell me what happens, right?" I mean, at this point, there was 8 books. I'm like, I got to know what happens between Jamie, between Claire. She wouldn't tell me. She didn't believe in spoilers. So I was forced to read all 8 books. It took me about 2 months. I had audio and, I read and I had audio. So I cheated a little bit, I guess. And no. And I guess at that point in time, like, my brain decided it would be fun to have these daydreams, I guess you could call them, about, well, what if the characters did this instead? And what if they were, in fairy instead? And what if this guy was a hot Scottish vampire? And what if, like, all these sort of things kind of, and, you play around with those ideas and they sort of just kind of build and build. And I found that I was seeing a lot of stuff in my mind, like scenes would come in, and I would see them. I would see like the characters, almost like a dream, but I'm sort of awake. So the third piece of that is that I had you, literally. I remember we were at a conference in New Orleans. I think it was a teaching professor conference, and we were having drinks. Alabama Slammers, I think, on the terrace in New Orleans. And I said, oh, I'm so excited. I have to tell you, I have this idea for a book in my head. And I wrote the first scene and it's in my head. And I remember telling it to you and you were just like, oh, you have to write this book. And it was like, oh, maybe I could write a book. And then we started on the journey of, you invited me to be part of your writers group. And then it just kind of like grew from there. And then of course we went to Scotland and we've had lots of playtime together since then. So it's probably those three things: my pregnancy with Jack and my intense reading of the metaphysical stuff and the mind-body connection, the falling in love with Outlander, who I found out later, she was also a professor who decided to write a book. So it was kind of like, oh, maybe I could do it too. And then having a supportive colleague like you that was there to, you know, say, that's not a stupid idea at all. I love it. Let's see where it goes. So that would be probably the three big things on that question.
Thanks. And that reminds me, so I'm really happy that you framed it that way, because it really does show us how we can take our lives, all of our lives, and then start thinking about, like, also that experience of seeing your characters in your head as if they're real people, like this movie that I still have with my angels, like this idea that you're not writing the story, it's being channeled through you. And I really like the idea. So that makes me think of the spaces that inspired your writing. So I'm not sure I can say the word, but you are a Caledonia-phile, whatever the word is.
I looked it up. I don't know how to say it either.
Tell me about your connection to your spiritual connection, I would say, metaphysical connection to Scotland, and then how you've actualized that. So where are the specific locations in Scotland, or wherever, because we've also done Ireland and London and Jane Austen's Trail, and what were some of the locations that inspired your work, and what's your connection, if you will, to the Scottish spirit, we'll say?
So the Scottish spirit, I have to give credit to Diana Gabaldon and the folks that produced the Outline. You know, just seeing it on the screen and then seeing it in my head as Diana Gabaldon was writing about it, it just was like an intense connection. Like, I have to go there. In which we just said one day, let's go. So we did. But there are, now that I've been to Scotland 4 times, and parts of Wales and London, and I think that there are some favorite parts. So when we first went on that first trip, I knew Angus, I knew Mara, I had all, you know, I had a number of scenes written, kind of stitched together. I didn't know where she was from. So it was on that first trip that we went to the Isle of Raasay on Skye, and we stayed at that gorgeous manor. And we sat and wrote in the library and had wine, and it was just amazing. And we got up the next day and we drove our Mercedes on a little bike path. You remember that? And we got to this old abandoned castle. And we got out of the car and I looked over and I said, this is it. This is, you know, it was a scene that I was writing at the time. I said, this is where she did that. This is where he lived. This is where, you know, and it was just there. It was just clear as day. This is it. And so from there, then I did some research on the MacLeods, and that's, you know, kind of their lands, and you know, did some of that historical research to kind of piece together some scenes and whatnot. But it really was going and seeing that, yeah, that I did it. So there are lots of scenes from America in the book, because I have been very fortunate to have seen all of America at this point, except for Alaska. So there is the scene I'll be reading in a little bit is outside of St. Augustine, Florida, Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. Supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the world. So there's that. Went to Graceland. There's actually a scene at Graceland. There's some local places as well. A lot of the magic is, and the paranormal stuff is rooted in the Bridgewater Triangle. So if you Google that, you could actually find some really cool stuff. And Mara is a professor there in the Bridgewater area. And there's also America's Stonehenge. There's a scene there. There's a beautiful place in northern New Hampshire where she goes and recovers for a while at the beginning of the book. So there's lots of places. And then, of course, one of my favorite places in the world, Haven, the Scottish restaurant and pub in Jamaica Plain, where we haven't been doing it a lot lately, obviously with what's going on in the world right now. But that has been a source of inspiration and sort of like not a second home, but like a second place to be. I don't know.
And what's the owner's name of the
What
Haven?
is the what?
The
Sorry.
owner's name of the Haven? What's the name of the guy who owns the Haven?
Jason. I know.
Person, he just follows you everywhere, Jason.
Everywhere. It's insane. I have had a lot of Jasons in my life. I was engaged to one actually before I met and married my husband. So Jason just shakes his head at me. I said, look, I knew I was going to be a little distracted in this life, a little spacey. I think I just like embedded somehow the code. Jason, find Jason. And I just kept finding Jasons. So, I know.
So I was going to ask you about the creation of your vampire lore, which I can do, but your book is very much what I would think of as urban fantasy. It's very much a supernatural world as opposed to a vampiric world. So can you tell us a little bit about, one, what your vampire lore is, what makes the people in your novel vampires, but also some of the other characters. So even your witches are very different. And so what makes the supernatural characters the way they are? And how would you describe their skills, magic, that kind of stuff?
So I guess there's I think have to answer one question first before I do that. And that has to do with probably when I first started writing, I thought that it was like a separate bucket for me, right? I mean, I love playing, I love like doing different things. But my world was so structured in that, okay, so this is my quantitative work. This is where I do, geospatial analysis and here's my teaching work. I teach police officers, I teach future, police officers. And then here's the metaphysical healing work that's rooted in trying to help friends and family. And then here's my novel over here. They were like these 4 distinct buckets, right? That I didn't see at first a whole lot of linkages to. And I'm not a history professor, right? And I have a very busy life. As you know, I'm constantly going. So I don't have a lot of time to study all those historical details that would make a historical fiction book. But I do have all that information about metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is not science per se in this, right? I mean, obviously it's, so I didn't expect to see so many parallels between what I do at work, what I do at home, and then the novel. But they started like slowly just popping in. Math is a big thread. Numbers is a huge thread. So whether I was studying what the Hopi tribe did, centuries ago, whether I'm looking at what the Lakotans did, whether I'm looking at what the Wiccans did or the Druids, there's this big connection of math that kind of goes through it, and trauma. Math and trauma, believe it or not, seem to be the things that sink the world. So even in the course room, I mean, my students, they come in, they're leaking trauma all over the place. So I found very quickly that I was doing healing work at the same time that I was teaching, and I was being inspired by my work on the, doing regression analyses, if you can believe it or not, and those numbers popping up and going, oh, that's a good number to use for, A, B, or C in the novel. So, so there's a lot of connections there. So in terms of putting that together relative to what makes my book different, and I don't know that it makes it different, because you read so much, you see so much has already been done, right? So I don't know that I have any unique thing to say about Angus is a vampire or Mara is a witch, but maybe the combination of things come together. So for example, I think one thing that makes Angus uniquely a vampire is he drinks blood. Like that's like one of the foundational pieces. The vampires in my novel don't have to drink blood to survive. They can eat. They're more like I don't want to say bats, but bats, and there's some other creatures out there that they're not really cold-blooded, but they're not really warm-blooded. And I'm not a biologist, so I don't remember what they are, but I remember, reading about them and seeing them, and they can like lift their temperature, their core temperature up and down to survive in different formats. They have very efficient metabolism. Like there's all these things that kind of made sense to me from a metaphysic and a scientific level. So I thought, well, I wonder what that would be like in a vampire, in a humanoid, immortal type thing. So there's lots of bits and pieces of that. And even though obviously, just like in any discipline, and there are different ways of thought, there are different theories about how things work on the metaphysical plane. So, but a lot of it overlaps. I mean, again, whether you're studying the Hopis or the Druids, a lot of it overlaps. And a lot of it overlaps, again, mathematically and with the comet, all of that stuff, the planets, everything. It's crazy. So, but blood is a big piece of the book. So in this writing, blood has multiple dimensions. So, and there are dimensions that humans don't necessarily know about. We don't have the technology to be able to identify whether or not, in fact, there are 12, dimensional DNA, whatever. But in my book, those dimensions carry the story of life. So sort of like the epigenetics of whatever, right? Right now, it's kind of a hot new area of research to look at epigenetics of trauma and how that kind of plays out. So the blood is basically the story. So as you're living your life, then my theory is that the blood is literally coding that information. And so I've seen this in other books, when the vampire drinks, he's pulling some of those stories out, right? It's not like it's going away. It's just he's able to read it, right? Sort of like a bloody USB drive. I know that sounds terrible, but he's able to access that information. And along with that, it's not just the experiences of the person whose blood the vampire is drinking, but it's their line. It's their entire line. Some of that stuff is much more deeply rooted and not as fresh in the blood that's flowing, but it's all there, which is an important piece because Mara's a reincarnated witch from Scotland. So, and she actually ends up being reincarnated from the same line. There's a couple jumps and twists, but she ends up being from the same line as Rowan, who is her first life, or I don't know if I should say first anymore now that we're talking about parallel universes and whatnot. It's her other life. So does that help?
It does.
Okay, and so in a lot of the Reiki and how I've understood based on my readings of how energy works and how the connection works, how the Akashic record. I mean, I've read stuff on near-death experiences, like how it all kind of comes together. I want is up to as close to what I'm seeing in the readings in the book. So instead of it's like historical fiction, it's metaphysical fiction. So everything that's there is rooted in someone's theory or someone's research, because there is some research on Reiki out there right now.
I think that really, really reflects not just who you are, but the idea of the scholar author, right? So all of this research that you're doing, instead of doing it instinctively, you're finding these really great ways to connect. It also makes you think about the work that Amanda herself does on trauma and learning about this idea that trauma is embedded across generations. And it's just very cool the way that you're bringing in not just your work, but your interests and making these really explicit connections, which are fascinating. And then of course it reminds me of my two timed with you in Scotland where the ghosts came home with me. And
I remember you like, we're like, what? Where is it? Right? Susan's looking for a bat. It's hilarious. Yeah, I know. And I'm like, oh, I want to see the ghost. Where is he? And you're like, no.
And the same thing happened to Amanda when we were in New Orleans. She brought back the ghost from that awful hotel, and it messed around with my jewelry. So this stuff is very real, right? It's very real, and it makes a lot of sense. And I really don't want to ask the next question yet, because I really want to know some more about, I don't know if you want to, if it's a spoiler or not, but are there people in your life that you've used as templates for characters in your novel? And do you want us to know, because they may be mad that you did, but
there's a few that obviously would know, and I'm not going to out them personally, but they, there are. So the best friend of Mara in the book is a combination of some family member and a really good friend at work. And so, and some of the conversations that we've actually had kind of inspire some of the conversation that's in the book, but it's different. So, and what I may have experienced with one friend over here that turned into, a hilarious night out, which then actually becomes part of the narrative over here. So yes, my husband is definitely a, with any interesting book, there's the dark and the light. So he's, you can see him in both, right? So yes, there's, just simple things like my love of motorcycles and tattoos, just that shows up. My husband and I ride motorcycle. I mean, that's one of our favorite things to do. And that shows up in the book a couple times. With different characters. So yeah, I mean, and there's a few things in there about you that are in there. I'm keeping those kind of secret until the big book launch party. But you'll be like, oh my God, that's me. But as you know, they're all fictional characters. It's just, but yeah, things just kind of provide you the inspiration. I mean, just being at Ripley's Believe It or Not, I was like, oh my God, they got Elvis hair here. This has to be a thing, like just those types of things. I don't know, I'm crazy. I guess I just find joy and inspiration in a lot of stuff. So,
which is interesting, your mentioning of trauma, right? And it's very clear from I've read so far about Mara, that she's carrying a huge weight both in her life and in her previous lives, and yet somehow there's still so much humor in there, and so much of it is very upbeat and healing, as opposed to dark and depressing, which is totally your personality, which again helps you understand why we write from ourselves as opposed to writing from out there and bringing it back to ourselves. That's very good.
Yes.
Right, so the very first time I got to know that you liked vampires, it was because I was doing my first book on Buffy, and you showed up with a life-size Spike, which I still have. And he serves as the guard in my office because he freaks everybody out. So if you want to tell us about your favorite on-screen vampire, maybe tell us a little bit more about your love of Spike.
Spike, of course, we're talking about Buffy the Vampire Show. I had a short first time obsession with Angel. For a little bit I was like, oh my God, star-crossed lovers and the whole thing, and oh my God, she had to push him in the portal and like all those things, right? I'm like, but it wasn't too long after that. I guess it was shortly after Spike got chipped. You remember, right? He got chipped, so he couldn't act on his base nature, right? And because I mean, he's a total dick, right? Like, but so that was taken away from him. And so you could really see other parts of him. And he doesn't apologize for being bad. He doesn't. It to him, it's just part of life. It's part of, part of growth. It's part of who you are. And he was funny. Like, oh my gosh, the one, talking about kids as walking Happy Meals, and when he's tied to a chair and he's like, the bear comes in that episode, the Thanksgiving episode, he's like, a bear, undo it, right? I mean, he's hilarious. Like, I just, and then he was singing in the episode, and I just fell in love with him. I thought that is the perfect, funny, sexy, kick-ass like vampire. That's the guy. So so that was Spike, and my sister actually bought Spike. So um I'm glad you still have him, because he was in my office for many years, and I had a Hawaiian lay around him for a long time too. I figured, how funny would it be if Spike went to Hawaii, right? It would be great.
It'd be very funny.
I know. So the other thing relative to Spike is that, and I think there was some stuff going on in my own life at the time, and I certainly was seeing things relative to some of my work on trauma at the offender level. So I had this epiphany. I was in a prison program. It was called Alternatives to Violence. And you basically go and you do a big circle with inmates, and you go on Friday night, you go all day Saturday, you go all day Sunday. So you basically spend almost your entire weekend in prison. And I remember this guy talking, and we were supposed to talk about things that, you know, shaped who we are, made an impact. And he was talking about one of his last crimes, and he had held a woman and her boyfriend at knife point. And nobody was killed, but it was a very traumatic event. He talked about seeing the fear in the woman's eyes. He felt very shameful about it, but he needed his drugs, he needed the money, so he did what he did. And that's what I think people think about a typical offender. And not that I'm condoning crime or violence, I'm totally not. But we tend to, I think, in this life, in this world, have this notion of dualities that plays out, right? Love and fear, love and hate. Like, so then he whips out this old newspaper article, and he says, later that day, he was actually either on his way to get drugs or on his way back from getting his drugs. A van had rolled over and was on fire on the side of the highway. And he stopped and he jumped out of his car and he pulled the mother and her kids out of that car, even a baby in a car seat. And he said, I probably will never have a straight life. He says, I don't know why that is, but he said, but me in prison, me as the knife wielding guy, I'm not just that guy. And it was sort of like this epiphany that you didn't have to be perfect to fit in any box. Like, and that you didn't have to fit in a box. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think that was the first epiphany that I had. And Spike, I think, was along for the ride, because, how could you love someone who did these horrible, horrible things, and who quite clearly is telling you over and over and over again, once this chip gets out of my head, I'm going to be a mean guy again, but you still rooted for him. You still loved him. And I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. I think you're picking up on the thing that I love about these types of characters, their complexity, right? That one thing that's often the flaw of not just romance, but of genre writing is the need to have a good guy and a bad guy. And so, and the good guy generally tends to be so boring. I'm really much more drawn to the hedonistic vampire one, because they're unapologetic, but also you get to see that they are it's Lestat, right? That's where this archetype comes from, that they're way more than just the bad guy. I think that's just so much sexier and more interesting to recognize that we are all many, many things rather than just bad. But it's
and that the process isn't really, I mean, not that, again, I don't condone violence, I don't condone any of that stuff, but being raised as a conservative Mormon, right? Like, I never quite understood, like, okay, so you just try to be good and perfect as much as you can, and then you die, like, and not that that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, but there are some things I probably shouldn't have done in my life that were so much fun. So I think part of it is the experience. I'm not talking about violence. We have to have a different conversation and space for that. But in the gray area, I don't think there's bad and good.
And we all live in the gray area, right? That's where we're supposed to be. Amanda, did you want to add something?
Yeah, let's connect it back to the trauma studies, because the other piece about these characters is that while they are broken and while they are living in that duality and living in those gray spaces, they're also bringing with it a significant amount of trauma. And so they're also the characters that we love because we want to heal, we want to help them heal. We want to help them figure out how to put the pieces of the brokenness back together, often with crazy glue, because that's what we need ourselves, is to be put back together with crazy glue. We need to be able to see that there's redemption, right, for them, but also for ourselves. I think sometimes it's why Spike is so interesting, right? His character arc is one that says this trauma happened to him in his real life and his pre-vampiric life, and that's part of what led him to where he was. Then he gets chipped, which is inherently a trauma that was against his will, that was violence. And he actually then makes choices to become the person that he wants to be, that still lives in the gray but puts himself back together. That's why these characters are so compelling.
Yeah. There's a lot, there's a lot of joy and there's a lot of fun and some cool metaphysical stuff in the novel, but there's also a lot of trauma. Every single character. The whole reason Angus became a vampire was to avenge, the death of his wife, and he had trauma from making that choice, and living with being in the dark, right, and being separate from those energies that would have allowed him to connect with Rowan on the other side. And there's some scenes with Mara that have been really hard for me to write, and so far I'm almost writing them backwards. I think you've seen one of those scenes where she wakes up from the trauma and is sort of remembering and processing, and at the same time healing physical and doing all those normal human things you have to do to heal. But again, that's where some of the energy work comes in, and so there's a lot of healing that does go on. And I think probably in this book, the healing does not take away what happened. It doesn't take away the memories. It doesn't, but it interrupts the connection between the emotion of that trauma in the moment and then what happened. So yeah, there's a bunch of trauma. I actually, who knows if this is a real thing or not, but I had read that words have power and that you can intend them. And so I've been intending every word with Reiki to try that, maybe if anything, if one person reads this book, hopefully it's the one person that really needs it and is actually healing as they read the book. Maybe not so much from the story, but from the intended energy in the words.
I think that's really beautiful. Yeah, and I think that it goes right back to what Amanda was saying, that we can. I think the thing you said at the end is really important. The idea that trying to find ways not to forget the trauma, but to absorb the trauma into yourself, right, as part of your experience. And that's very much kind of a way that Mara's having to deal with it, without all these spoilers. But the idea that she's having to bring together multiple parts of herself that aren't literally herself, they are also other people. I think that's again, it's what we do, right? As people try to find ways to process. And so often what we tend to do is wall that part off of ourselves, as opposed to really healing, which is absorbing that part into yourself and separating yourself from the trauma, from the feeling of the trauma. I love the idea that it's intentional, that there might be, because you never know how a novel affects somebody, and it might affect one person or 10 million people, right? And if it can heal somebody from reading, that's a really good thing. But that brings me to another question, and I'm sorry, this isn't another question I was going to ask you, but So you read a lot, and I read a lot, and I'm a very fast reader. And for a while, we shared an Amazon account.
We
But
did.
Holy
We need to do
Mother,
that again.
no, because Holy Mother of God, you suck down books where I suck down coffee. It's insane. So you mentioned it a little bit, which I wanted to ask you a little bit more. Do you find that that's distracting or helpful, seeing all of the things that other people have? And do you find yourself, after you've read 3 different series in one weekend, not realizing you're taking things from those novels and you're writing or writing like that? So how does it affect you reading so much?
So, so a couple of things. One, I've had to make deals with myself, right? Because originally I wanted the book to be done in 2 years, and now we're going on year 4. It is almost done. I mean, I've sent you the whole all the edited stuff. It's almost done. So in one way, all that reading is a distraction, because I'm laying in, bed or a cozy chair reading and not working on my own stuff. I can't say, so this might be a weird thing. I don't know if anybody else processes this way. When we're talking about data or numbers or that sort of thing, I have a pretty good memory, it's not photographic, but it's pretty good. But and it has always been this way with movies and books, fiction. I'll remember a few specific scenes, but I don't remember, I could read Cresley Cole's books again and be surprised, oh my God, I can't believe he did that. Well, the one side of me is well, are you surprised you read this book? But I remember less about what they say or what they do, and more about what I'm feeling in the moment that I'm reading it. And I feel like those feelings of love, lust, terror, horror, shock, that's what I remember. And so I think, okay, well, how would this play out? What texture would this look like? That's not it. But emotions have texture to them. They have, these nuance. When you're thinking compassionately about one person, it feels and looks this way. And when you're thinking about somebody else, it feels and looks this way differently. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I remember those. That's what I remember from reading. And, occasionally there are things that'll stick with me and I'll go, oh, I really like that about the vampires, or, oh, I really like the bromance between, the fairy and the werewolf. I think Angus needs a bromance. Those types of things definitely impact and are helpful. But I had to do things like I've never watched Game of Thrones. I went with you to the museum and just hurried up and did the Cliff Notes version. Okay, that's those people, that's these people, this is what happened. Well, that's where Jason Momoa came from, right? All those things. I still haven't seen it because I made myself a deal not to get started on any of those series. And so if I was awake enough and sitting up watching TV, I could also be writing on my book. So I haven't made that deal with me on reading yet, because I just love reading. I get lost in the story. It's one of the reasons why I never watch soap operas. I can't handle I'm screaming at the screen. I'm like, don't, he's cheating on you. Don't go there. I just get so wrapped up in the story that, yeah, I can't. It'll be a hole. So everybody else is binging. I haven't even finished Tiger King because I'm not watching that much. I'm just not watching that much TV.
Well, your one task is to finish. And actually, you would be watching Dracula, that would be one of my big things that I'd recommend, because of the way he retells that story. So this is a fun question, because it kind of goes with actually you. So if you were quarantined for several months for some reason, like a pandemic, that would never happen because that doesn't happen. But somehow you were quarantined. What sort of vampire would you want to be quarantined with, and why? And here's an addendum to that: would Jason be there or would not? Actually, I guess would your family be there with you while you were quarantined? Be a better. Yeah.
You want me to have a fun quarantine? Although you've traveled with me, you know, after about a week or so, I miss my kids. I miss them dearly. And after a couple weeks, I miss my husband. So yeah, he definitely, you know, at some point should, you know, at least be on the rescue boat to pick me up off the island or something. But, you know, you'd think I would say Spike.
No,
And
because he might kill you. He might kill you. He'd play with you. He'd play with you, then kill you. Yeah.
I want a chipped Spike. But I, you know, thinking about it and knowing what's fun for me, and knowing that I love like playing with ideas and I love learning things and I love like stitching things together in my head, I would definitely want Matthew Claremont from the All Souls trilogy, because think about it, months and months and months. Think about all of history that you would learn about. And he knew all these famous authors and playwrights and politicians, like he knew everybody, right? So he could tell you about his experience. It'd be like, I mean, not that you get out of a PhD in history, but think about all the stuff that you would just know. And it would just be thinking about the conversation. Yes, he's hot. Yes, you know, you got that going, but you know, you can't just be hot all day. You got to do something. You got to talk. You got to, you know, and he also knew a lot about blood and DNA. I mean, he was just, you know, he studied that stuff in the book. Like, I think it would just be eye and ear candy for me to just hang out with Matthew Claremont for a couple months.
I think that's interesting. Everybody we ask that question to always wants someone who has that historical knowledge. And I think when I first heard the question, I would have thought of Eric Northman or Lestat. But now I realize that that would get old very quickly because they're very whiny and self-absorbed. So having somebody would actually, yeah, you want to have an exchange with for months would be much more interesting than hearing a guy. Essentially, I could imagine Eric would sit in the mirror and talk, and then get really whiny and then kill me, which would be fine, but it wouldn't last very long. So Amanda, who would be your person you'd be in quarantine with?
Well, you know, I think Becky kind of hit it. Like, I think of Matthew. I don't know. I think of oh gosh, just like, I mean, Dracula is interesting in and of himself, right? Like as the precursor of all of this, though. You know, maybe not. I know Carmilla would be interesting, particularly the web series version. Carmilla, just like fun and like you can imagine like watching movies and eating popcorn. I don't know. There's so many, but Matthew was who my brain went to truly initially just because of all that knowledge. Yeah.
And that, I think that also connects with what makes us so interested in vampires, right? It's that, I mean, I know that I'm a historian, but that's the idea of, yeah, these great conversations, but carrying all this knowledge forward, right? And I think that's one of the things about your brain, Becky, that I love so much, that my brain is very foggy. You're so great at retaining and compartmentalizing and then bringing things together. And like, I could ask you about an episode of Buffy that happened, I don't know, in season 1, and you could tell me, and I'd be like, I didn't even know that was in season 1. But it's those kind of really great sense of recall that you have that I think it works super well then for writing a novel, particularly with your sense of humor, which I keep coming back to. So I could see the two of you just sitting for hours. I could see you driving him crazy though, because I could see him, because you'd have a million questions for him. And I think after a while, like, shut up.
I would, I know, I would have a hard time sleeping. I'd be like, oh, I got a few months with this guy. I gotta learn. I gotta, you know, maybe I could become a vampire and just like suck his blood and all of his knowledge would just like, right?
That bit I like the most, right? If there was a way to suck someone's blood and gain all their knowledge, I'd run after people like Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. Not so much for their education or whatever, but for their literal body of knowledge in their minds. That would be fascinating to me. But knowing me, it would all drain out the other end, so it wouldn't stay. But I do like the idea of that a lot. Okay, so what advice, I think you said has been fantastic advice so far anyway, right? So I know you don't think of yourself yet as a novelist, but you are. and that you've always been a writer, because obviously you have textbooks and you do all this stuff and you're up, so we're seeing the ways in which you're bringing those things together. What advice do you have for someone who, like you were 4 years ago? They had these ideas in their head, they were seeing these dreams. What would your advice be for someone wanting to start writing their first novel, or whether they can or not?
One, just to do it. And, you know, obviously I had a very supportive person in my life who was also connected, who's also a fantastic writer and who should also be interviewed. That was there for me. So, you know, find that person that is your connection to the passion that you have, and just do it. And, you know, for me, a lot of it is internal and mental first before it goes on the page. So I'm lucky in that I've never had writer's block, because it takes me weeks and weeks before I can actually sit down without distractions and kids and type. So it's all here. But just when you get those moments, like, type it out, write it out, do something with it. And this, I think, is a product of being almost 50, right? I mean, less than 2 years. Ooh, we gotta go to Scotland or do something fun, by the way.
Yes.
But it's be okay with who you are. Like, you are exactly who you need to be. You are exactly where you need to be. Nothing about you is wrong. Nothing about you is bad. Nothing. Just do it. Like, I when I started writing, you know, and I still do, I come to the writers' meetings and I'm like, I have no idea what this poem means, but I'll tell you what was in my head when I read it, right? Like, because I don't have that knowledge. I don't, you know, and I'm a political scientist teaching criminal justice classes, which are often mathematical classes, and now I think I'm a novelist, right? But when it brings you joy, like, stay with that joy and it'll take you where you need to be. And please, 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 just be okay with who you are. Like, that's, I think, the most important thing to success with anything. Be okay with who you are. And having good friends around you is so, because they see you differently, right? I mean, I look at my to-do list every day and all I see is failure. I didn't get this done. I didn't get this done. I mean, you know, and I forgot for a long time all the things that I did do. And then I listen, like, you tell me all the time, your life is exhausting. How do you live it? It's like, I think I'm kind of lazy. So, you know, have those people around you, like, that love you for who you are. And please, please, please be okay with yourself. Just love who you are. You're amazing.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. All right, so I am so excited to announce you're going to read us a special excerpt from your novel.
Okay.
This is actually a big deal because this will be the first public performance of your writing. Not to get no pressure. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
No, I'm not a performance artist. Just being aware. So I will read it. Okay.
Do you want to set up the scene? Actually, no, don't set up the scene. I think you should just dive in. No, I think you should dive in. Yes.
Okay. Unfortunately, there was a long line of eager tourists already in place before we arrived at the Ripley's Museum. Thankfully, it wasn't boiling hot yet, and there was a light breeze that helped keep me cool. It wasn't the first time I was jealous of Angus's ability to adjust his body temperature to the environment. As for Daniel, he never seemed to be bothered by the weather. Perhaps his fake clothing was spelled to keep him comfortable. Ugh, this is going to be a long day. We talked at length at breakfast this morning about the museum tour. Angus and Daniel both hoped that we would be able to snatch a lock of Elvis's hair while we were touring the museum, using glamour to hide what we were up to. If we were successful, we could be back on the plane this afternoon and in Boston by dinner. A potential snag, according to the guys, was that the strange and unusual, aka Ripley's entire collection, was typically supernatural. Tie in a few dead celebrities who were likely full or even part fae, and voila, potential unpredictable situation. Daniel had also announced at breakfast that the building housing Ripley's collection was infested with ghosts. Apparently, fairies and ghosts were not fond of one another. My life is so weird. After a 30-minute wait, we arrived at the ticket desk. A bored-looking cashier took our money, and we proceeded through the turnstile to the first exhibit. Greeting us, just inside the entrance, was a young security guard with the prettiest green eyes I had ever seen. She had a full head of light blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she stood as still as one of the guards at Buckingham Palace. There's another. Aside from the ridiculous-looking uniform, complete with a name tag spelling Becky with a Y, she was gorgeous, like crazy off the charts beautiful. I wondered briefly why she was working at what was probably only a minimum wage job when she could be off having an exotic modeling career somewhere. I smiled and said hello as we passed by, but like the palace guard, she did not acknowledge my greeting. Instead, she continued to stand straight as a rod and look alert, as if she were guarding the crown jewels and not the weird taxidermy specimens that hung on the walls around us. There wasn't a map to the exhibit, so we had to walk through several rooms before we found Elvis's hair. Framed simply and hung on the wall against a drawing of Elvis's likeness and an attached magnifying glass, it could easily be missed amongst other, more prominent artifacts, such as the Marilyn Monroe portrait made entirely out of toast. Huh, I did not see that coming. Daniel was the first to speak. Angus, do you see her? I'm not sure why she's here, but the White Witch is unpredictable at best. I do not want to cross her if we can help it. I see her. Maybe she won't be any trouble. If she interferes, we will have to come back tonight. We cannot afford a scene. Go talk to her while I think. Talk to her, he says, mumbled Daniel as he walked closer to the Marilyn Monroe exhibit. As I watched him walk, I noticed Becky, aka Barbie Guard, was standing next to the toast portrait underneath a bright set of lights, making her light hair and pale skin almost luminescent. Becky's a witch? Thinking Daniel was headed to talk with Becky, I was surprised when instead he walked past her and stopped near a display of high-heeled shoes once owned by Ms. Monroe. Wondering what in the hell was going on, I watched him appear to talk, no, argue, with himself for a time, and then walk briskly back to Angus, who was now studying some two-headed monkey displayed on a shelf. Ever curious, I walked closer to them in hopes of finding out what was going on. She's not a fan of me or my kin, Angus, and she is still pissed at Kellen. We should come back after hours. Angus replied, I disagree. She's pissed at Kellen, not us, and a small lock of his hair means nothing to her. Besides, Kellen is as likely to visit this place as he is to make a vow of celibacy. Let's go to work. Mara, keep your ears and eyes open while Daniel and I get the hair. With any luck, we can celebrate in Boston tonight. I nodded my agreement and the guys walked towards the Elvis hair. I felt a light wave of magic as they glamored themselves, and a quick look in their direction confirmed their current invisible status. Officer Barbie, however, suddenly sprinted towards their location. Oh, for goodness sake, what do you think you two are doing? Becky's from Minnesota. That's also a surprise. Although I couldn't see Angus or Daniel, I could hear Daniel's response. It's impossible. You can't see us. What in tarnation are you smoking, boys? Of course I can see you. Oofta. Why do I get all the crazies? You can't touch the exhibit. It's a museum, not a you touch 'em. Geez Louise, I swear you tourists get dumber every year. By this time, Angus and Daniel had released the glamour and were looking at each other with very confused expressions. After a brief pause, Angus replied, Becky, is it? That's a lovely name for a lovely lass. Any chance you're free for lunch? I would love for us to get to know each other better. A very strong wave of compulsion magic waved past me, so strong that I almost said yes to Angus myself. Becky, on the other hand, was not enamored or amused. Are you trying to bribe an officer of the law? Uh-oh, Becky's a null. You boys just got yourself banned from the museum. Come quietly and I won't have to call in for backup. My internship is almost over and I don't want another incident bunking up my chances to win the Criminal Justice Honor Award. That's it.
I cannot wait to read the rest of it. It's so funny. And those teeny tiny little details that you keep infusing are super, super clever. Thank you so much, Rebecca Lynn Paynich. It was a fantastic session. Any final thoughts?
No, thanks for doing this. It was a lot of fun.